You're listening to Three Things to Know with Stephanie Haney, with experts and insiders on what you need to know in Northeast Ohio.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Three Things to Know podcast. I'm Stephanie Haney. Appreciate you being here with me. Today, we are talking about something that's very timely. We are talking about moving on, building a bridge, getting over it, getting through it, getting to the other side, and dealing with disappointment, because the current state of affairs is still a little bit tumultuous right now. Yeah, we are in a pretty difficult spot when it comes to the pandemic, of course. If you're a sports fan, you might be feeling a little bit let down that the Cleveland Browns won't be playing football this weekend, even though we did make a great showing. 2 playoff games. Of course, we didn't win that game against the Kansas City Chiefs. Can you tell I'm dealing with processing that one a little bit? We just had the inauguration. Maybe your guy didn't win. Maybe you're disappointed about that. But we have to move forward because disappointments don't last forever. And as they say, the only way out is through. So we're going to be talking about that today. We're going to be talking about moving forward, dealing with disappointment, coming together, and getting past all of those difficult feelings by feeling them and working through them and getting then over to the other side. We're going to do that by talking about the 5 stages of grief, which is a common idea in psychology. So, of course, we are going to talk to a psychologist about it. My guest today to get us in the know on all of these things is Cleveland Clinic psychologist Dr. Scott B. So let's bring him in right now. Dr. B, thanks for being here on the Three Things to Know podcast today.
Real pleasure. Thanks for having me, Stephanie.
You know, right now, we are kind of just in a time where there are a lot of difficulties that people are experiencing. And when things don't go our way, it can be tough to move on. But beyond just the peace of mind that comes with that, I kind of just want to emphasize the fact that this is really a whole holistic thing. You know, when you can move past something and get that acceptance, there's actually physical benefits. Can you talk to me about some of those?
Sure, Stephanie. What goes on in our brain goes on in our bodies, of course. So when we're upset emotionally, we're also experiencing problems with our bodies. We might feel fatigued. We might not be sleeping very well. We can have stress hormones circulating that are affecting other organ systems, including our hearts, our gastrointestinal system. So anytime we find ourselves moving toward a more peaceful spot in our thoughts and in our brains, we're going to have a little bit better peace when we lay down at night. We're going to be a little more energized. We might have some relief from those stress hormones. So our heart rate may drop down a little bit. Our muscles might relax a little bit more. Our digestive process might move along a little bit more smoothly. So there are lots of benefits for taking good care of our brains.
Peace, relaxation, better sleep, all of those things sound so wonderful. Who wouldn't want that, right?
Exactly. But it's hard, we're humans. It's hard to come by sometimes.
That is true. That is definitely true. We are all human, and some kinds of disappointments are a little bit more difficult to get over than others. But generally, there is a process when it comes to these things, right? We hear often about the 5 stages of grief. Can you talk to me a little bit about that first stage, denial?
Yeah, this was postulated by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, these 5 stages. And initially, when some big loss or disappointment comes into our lives, it's hard to believe. And that can often last for a very long time. We lose a loved one. There's often a persistence in that disbelief and the shock. It's something we're not used to. And that's kind of what captures our attention initially and affects our brains. It's probably protective in some ways, but we have to move past that.
So when you do move past that, the second stage, or I don't know if they're numbered in this way, but another stage, right, is anger. Tell me about that one.
They are numbered, but we certainly don't have to move through those consecutively, or it's not the case that, we move through discreetly. We go back and forth through these stages. So it's ordinary to feel upset. If it is the loss of a loved one, often we're upset that they left us or abandoned us or left us alone. And it's ordinary to come into touch with those feelings. It's sometimes at odds with our experience if it is loss or a big change, but anger is a very common component of that. Sometimes we can actually feel guilty for having these feelings. We'd like to normalize that, allow ourselves to have these sentiments.
Here's one that I think is particularly interesting, the bargaining phase, because it seems to me that that sort of implies that you have some power in a situation, and I don't know that that's always the case.
It's probably an illusion, but it's something that is very ordinary for humans, where we're trying to make a deal to get something back that we've lost, to have it go somehow our way when it didn't go our way. So it's real ordinary for our thoughts to drift into that direction. It's a spot that a lot of people find themselves, but it's often the case that we don't stay there for very long.
This is kind of the situation where you find maybe saying to yourself, if you believe in a higher power or whatever it is, if I do this, or I'll never do this again, if just this thing can happen, right?
Yeah, it can be that belief in a higher power. Sometimes it's superstition. And as human beings, we're a little prone to that too. So we're trying to influence oftentimes things that are a bit outside of our control.
And then there's the phase when it comes to the real sadness, the depression phase. Talk to me about that.
That's an ordinary response to loss. As humans, it's not the thing that we're looking for in life. Sometimes we can wonder, how can we go on in the face of whatever it is that we're facing, an adversity, a significant loss or change. And so depression is a very inward thing. We're usually very much in touch with our own thoughts and feeling states. It takes energy away from us. It takes motivation away from us. And sometimes, again, we tend to isolate ourselves and withdraw. Again, it's a spot that many of us get to, but it's not a great place to stay.
And finally, the Holy Grail, acceptance.
Yeah.
And that's when you've worked through it and you're just okay, right?
We may not be okay, but acceptance is a really important thing. Sometimes it's termed radical acceptance, where we really have to move hard to the allowance for this to be in our lives. It doesn't mean that we like it. It may mean that we have to continue to adjust ourselves to it throughout a course of time in our lives. But it's a really smart spot because it's a gift ultimately to ourselves. It's a step toward recovery. Life is not always going to go our way. Things aren't always going to fall in our lap. And so there's a bit of ruggedness that we have to display as humans, but it is what allows us to move forward and through so many things that we have to cope with. And most humans have, very rich histories of coping. And I think that's important not to forget that. And acceptance is a big part of that. By the way, it doesn't mean that we're rolling over. It's actually a sign of resilience.
And I think that's so important that you noted too. I said, sure, you're okay, but it's okay to not be okay. And sometimes that's just part of it, is accepting that part of it too.
Yeah, and in athletics, they talk about playing hurt. And I think a lot of times we get out and play despite the hurt.
Now, you talked about how these things, they are numbered, but you don't necessarily go through them in a particular order. You might move back and forth through certain stages. But do you have to go through all of these stages to get to acceptance?
I don't believe so. I've certainly seen people get to an acceptance very quickly, very efficiently. Some people will say, you're not doing the right thing, or coach them against their approach to acceptance. There are so many paths up the mountain. We're all different as humans. And so we may move back and forth through these. We may get stuck. We sometimes call those instances complicated grief. In other instances, people are pretty efficient at getting to a different spot and at a real spot of acceptance and moving on with their life.
What's your advice? We talked about this for just a moment earlier, but when the thing that's bothering you is out of your control, like maybe your favorite football team lost a big game, or it's the actions of a person that have you feeling upset. So what do you do when you literally you don't have any control over the thing that's bothering you?
It's very interesting, Stephanie. I think humans like the notion of control. We don't control very much at all. Sometimes in psychotherapy, we'll say we control two things: our behavioral choices and our attitudes. And so much is outside of our governance. What I would really notice is how people have, in many occasions in their lives, gotten past things, been readjusted, even to things that didn't go our way. So we kind of want to notice that the road is just out ahead of us. They say you can't drive looking in your rearview mirror. So resetting yourself somehow into the present with a little bit of verve or vigor or encouragement sometimes is the best we can do. Often we don't get exactly what we want, but again, we have long histories of coping with that.
Speaking of not getting what you want, if you scroll through Instagram, I know Instagram is no substitute for psychology or talking with a professional, but if you look on Instagram, it might certainly think it is. But we'll see these quotes, right? It becomes easier over time to accept an apology you never got, or so on and so forth. When you're dealing with something else, something outside of you, a person, a thing that happened, you might not always get that remorse that you want or the reasoning behind it, or somebody might not be paying for or punished for the thing that's bothering you. So how can you move on when the thing that you're upset over doesn't feel resolved to you?
It's interesting that we even have the concept of closure, because I think in a practical way, it rarely happens. And if is the person that broke our heart gonna circle back and give us a nice explanation that restores us so we can move on? It rarely occurs that way. I think one thing that really helps is noticing what your real life is right now, living presently, coming into this moment. Sometimes you have to remind yourself of what you're seeing, smelling, hearing, tasting, and feeling from outside your body to come back here now. That's where real life is happening. It's not happening here. We may never get the apology, but it doesn't mean our real lives aren't going on right now. Investing in our real lives is one of the best adjustments to those losses or to the lack of apology. And oftentimes the apology isn't as curative as people imagine anyway. Our brains like the idea of rightness, might be a victory, but it won't last long.
When you talk about being in the present moment, this is a great point, I think, to bring up the fact that sometimes our reactions to things aren't about what's actually even happening right now. Instead, we're reacting based on past experiences that might not necessarily apply, sort of projecting those things or what have you. So what's your tip to be mindful of that and separating the past from the present?
I tell you what, it's one reason people come to psychotherapy sometimes, is to gain insight. What factors, from my past and history affect me now, and how do they? So psychotherapy is one way to do that. I'll tell you what, if you're in a partnered relationship, one interesting exercise might be to tell that person or a loved one or somebody that's close to you the story of your life from your earliest remembrance to the present moment. We almost never tell that story in a consecutive way. We tell our story in little bits and pieces. But if you were to tell somebody that story, you would start to put pieces together that hadn't occurred to you before and start to notice influences in your life that you might never have conceived. It might be that that person who's listening also can help put some of those pieces together. Now, understanding the whys, it's really a seductive thing. We all want that a little bit. It often doesn't change what our brains are doing. So even if we have that notion, we probably still have to practice some new strategies, techniques, behaviors in order to change habits, because those exist in our brain. What we're really trying to do is influence what our brain does, both now and into the future. So the insights can be useful, but I think learning some new strategies, willingness to adopt some new habits, including acceptance, if it's not been our strong suit to this point, would be really great ideas.
Okay, so once we get to the point of accepting that letdown or that loss or whatever the thing is that's been bothering us, you've got how you're feeling about it, however which way that is. How do you get motivated then to try again, to keep pushing forward, to move on to the next thing, to let the bygones be bygones?
Well, I'll go back to something we spoke about just a moment ago. Come back into this moment. They teach kids this, I think, in sports these days. They teach them little symbols like let it go or brush it off and kind of reset to this next thing. In baseball, they might say next pitch. In football, it might be next play. But I think we want to notice that our life does not stop. It's always moving, and being really present, noticing our capacities, our assets, what we possess that helps us move through our lives. Those are the things that are going to make the biggest difference for us. And as I say, be here now. It's a great place of great peace. We spend a little too much time in our heads. We have a tendency to be overthinkers, and that takes us away from what's really going on out here.
Oh, you were speaking to me about the overthinking thing right now. I definitely feel that. Dr. B, these have been such great tips. Thank you so much for coming on with us today. I appreciate it.
It was a real pleasure. Thanks for having me, Stephanie.
In case you couldn't tell, Dr. B had me at the sleep and the peace of mind. Oh my gosh, does that sound wonderful, right? But it's a process. Definitely work to get through these steps. And we need to be kind to ourselves while we're going through that process because it does take time. It is an energy investment in order to move through things, move on with things, deal with disappointment, look forward to the other side, focus on that progress and that unity. And that's a beautiful thing when you can get there. Okay, now we're going to talk about what you need to know in NEO, but we're going to do things a little bit differently this week. Normally I bring someone in to share this with us, but there's something that I've been dying to tell you all about, so I'm just going to take it from here this week. What you need to know in NEO, if you're not already aware of it, is the existence of West Side Salsa. It is so good. So good. It's by the West Side Salsa Company, which is based out of Rocky River. It's a local company. You can only get it in a couple of places, and this is literally liquid gold. When I tell you that this stuff is good, I'm not exaggerating. All of the people that I've introduced it to that don't live in the downtown Cleveland area are always asking me to bring it to them. So I've basically become an unofficial West Side Salsa delivery person because it is that good. Now, how I became aware of this delicious salsa is, no joke, my very first day in downtown Cleveland was in my apartment less than an hour. My best friend from high school showed up. She had a bottle of champagne, some veggie sushi, and a tub of West Side salsa. And that is how you know that someone is a good friend, my friends, because it is delicious. Now, you can only get it in a couple of places. Those places are Constantino's Market in downtown Cleveland, the Lake Road Market in Rocky River, Ross Wine and Liquor in Bay Village, and Ross Beverage and Deli in Lakewood. And that is it. Definitely worth making the trek out or finding someone who's by one of those places to be so kind as to make that delivery to you, because they don't deliver at this time. They posted on their website in August that they are not currently shipping to any location, and it will only be available locally for the foreseeable future. So if you're in one of those neighborhoods, I highly recommend that you check it out. Speaking of delicious foods, that brings us to a good follow for this week. On Instagram, the CLE Bucket List. They post the most mouth-watering photos of the best takeout options in the Northeast Ohio area. But that's not all, because of course it's called the CLE Bucket List. They have a ton of cool stuff on there. Right now they have a winter bucket list full of ideas that you can do that are COVID safe to get you through the winter here in Northeast Ohio, which we know can seem to drag on for a while. And along those same lines, if you are someone who's comfortable going to patios, they've got a whole list of heated patios in the Northeast Ohio area, and great ideas for Cleveland staycations, because traveling isn't really recommended right now, but you might want to get out just a little bit. So if you can do that within your sort of bubble, your geographical bubble, they've got some great ideas for that. And I'm not kidding, if you look at this feed, there are so many great takeout ideas, desserts, coffees, and all kinds of cuisines too. Highly recommend it. Maybe not if you're hungry, or maybe if you want some ideas. If you're starving and you want some ideas and you want to look at their takeout, then yes, great. But if it's going to be a little bit of time before you can get that food, you might want to wait. But definitely put it on your radar, the CLE Bucket List on Instagram. Great follow. And who doesn't love beautiful pictures of food? Everybody loves that. All right, that's it for the 3 Things to Know podcast this week. If you're liking the show, I would love it if you would subscribe and also share it with a friend. Leave a rating and a review. That helps us connect with more people here in Northeast Ohio. Until next week, my friends, I'm Stephanie Haney.
Thanks for listening to 3 Things to Know with Stephanie Haney from WKYC Studios. Subscribe now to stay in the know.